Good afternoon. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. Welcome to one of the best panel discussions during the Ludovika Festival. I hope I'm not putting the pressure too high on our panelists. The name of the panel discussion is the new global game, winners, losers, and power plays. So let me introduce our great speakers. Sir Liam Fox, chairman of the UK Abraham Accords Group and the former British Secretary of State for Defence and Secretary of State for International Trade. Thank you very much for coming. Professor Tomohiko Taniguchi, specially appointed professor at the University of Tsukuba and a special advisor to the Fujitsu Future Studies Center. He served as a special advisor to Prime Minister Abe. And on my right, Anthony Kim from Heritage Foundation, editor of the Index of Economic Freedom. Thank you very much for joining us today in Budapest, in Hungary. So let me start with the introductory question to all of you. So we will have the same question. And I would like to start with the question, if you could choose one key idea or value that should guide countries in today's new global competition, what would it be? And we will start with Sir Liam Fox.
Freedom. Can you hear me? Yeah, so freedom in all its aspects. A country like Hungary should understand more than most the value of freedom and what the alternative looks like. And if we think that freedom is good enough for us, and it is essentially who we are and makes us and makes our countries what they are, then it should be good enough for everybody else. And the idea that freedom is something that we should have, but in any way we should deny it to others, is morally unacceptable.
Thank you very much. Professor Tomohiko Taniguchi.
Thank you very much. I should say exactly the same thing as Sir Liam. Freedom. But freedom has to be institutionalized. In what way? The same old institutions like democratic system, open government, checks and balances. I wouldn't want to live under a regime where you can't make any criticism toward your leader.
Thank you very much. And Antony?
Well, first of all, it's great to be back in Budapest, Hungary, especially this time with you guys, Ludovika University. I understand this is a fourth edition of this wonderful festival, and hopefully this journey continues. Now, my answer to Liliana's first question, I'm not copying these wonderful, fine gentlemen, but I also agree the key word here is freedom. But if I may, I want to add two more footnotes. When we talk about freedom, this is a very big concept and principle and notion. But if I may, I want to add like economic freedom as well as political freedom. In a way, this is very much in line with what these two gentlemen already talked about. But I want to also say, when we talk about freedom, freedom is not some kind of magic. It doesn't come to us automatically. We got to talk about it. We got to even demand it, whatever level, state, local, national level, international stage. So I think being proactive about talking about freedom and really kind of earning and demanding, I think that's really important. So rather than putting freedom as a notion, let's actionizing it, let's operationalize in terms of pursuit of freedom.
All right, so the freedom would be the main theme of today's discussion. I think especially in this region of the world, Central Eastern Europe, we actually understand what freedom is because we had to fight for it and we know how to preserve it. I forgot to introduce myself before. My name is Liliana Śmiech. I'm so sorry. We know each other, but for the audience, I wanted to make sure that we know each other. So let's go to the more specific questions. Balance of power in the world has changed. So my question to Sir Liam Fox would be, how actually did it change, and what the Western democracies should do to keep their influence in the current, very dynamic world situation?
Well, I think to answer that question, you need to go back to our first principles. We touched on one, which is freedom, and recognize that freedom, rule of law, including international rule of law, democratic systems, are in a perpetual battle with their opposites, which are the concept that might is right, arbitrary justice, tyranny and oppression of rights. And we've gone through a long period where our side, if you like, we're winning that argument. And we now find ourselves in a different place. And why? Because we have forgotten to defend all those freedoms. Anthony mentions economic freedom. No doubt we'll come on to the elements around trade and distortions of trade and how that impacts on developing countries, for example. But also we need to remember that when isolationism rears its ugly head, vacuums are created. When those of us who believe in those various values decide to turn inwards on ourselves rather than reflecting those values globally, you will get a vacuum created. So where the United States is pulling back in areas of the world, take Africa for one, it's unsurprising that Chinese influence is increasing, because we have this perpetual battle between these two very different views of what the future of humanity should be. And another problem is that we have confused concepts of patriotism and nationalism. And patriotism, which I would define as pride in our culture, our history, and our heritage, is not the same as nationalism, which is very often based on a definition of what we don't like or who we don't like and their exclusion. And getting these concepts very clear in our minds are essential. Getting those first principles right are key to being able to win that wider battle. And in politics today, it's very much become about the weeds and the small issues and personality and other things. And you know, I still long for the era of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, when we had real clear concepts of right and wrong, and what we wanted for the world and what we didn't want for the world. And I feel that we require that intellectual clarity in our politics if we're going to make any progress in redressing a balance which is no longer to our advantage in the way that it was in the past.
And Sir Fox, you mentioned isolation. Did I hear correctly? But would you say that isolation can have an equal mark to protectionism, or these are totally two different terms?
No, one's a symptom of the other. You know, we need to remember, and politicians should remind people, that free trade is how we have taken 1 billion of our fellow human beings out of abject poverty in a generation. And if you accept that to be true, to turn your back on that and to start to reverse the economic freedoms that we're taking the human race forward is a major mistake. Although when you're talking about isolationism, and let's face it, we're talking about American isolationism here, we have become used to the post-World War II America, which is a much more internationally engaged America than America pre-World War II was. And so we need to constantly be reminding people what the costs of isolationism can be, economically, socially, and militarily, and making sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of history.
But I don't want to go too far. But looking at the thank you. But looking at the current policies, I wouldn't say that only U.S. let's say is using this kind of policies. But actually, if we look at certain activities pursued by European Union, and for example, the climate policy or CBAM mainly, I would say it also has some kind of let's say signs of protectionism policies.
You're tempting me into a very different area of policy. But if I, just for the sake of this audience, point out the scale of the problem. At the end of the financial crisis in 2009, only 0.7%, less than 1% of all the imports coming into the G20 countries were covered by a restrictive mechanism, either a tariff or a non-tariff barrier, or a technical barrier to trade. That 0.7% by the first quarter of 2020 had grown to 10.3%. In other words, the world's richest countries were putting up more and more barriers to the world's poorest countries. Now, if you can't trade your way out of poverty, you're much more likely to get on a boat or get on a road. And if you get that dislocation in global trade, don't be surprised if you get a big increase in global migration. So the economic freedoms that Anthony mentioned have a consequence in terms of security. The European Union, I'm afraid, was and is a major problem in this by using non-tariff barriers to trade, using consumer legislation, environmental legislation, and others to make it more difficult for products to enter into the European Union. President Trump was absolutely right on that issue, and it's one of the reasons that I voted to leave the European Union.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Taniguchi, if you look at the global shifts, how does it look like from your perspective, especially if we're looking at the rising China, but at the same time where US still plays key role in the politics?
The balance of power is being struck, as you all know, between the two superpowers, namely China and the United States. When it comes to longevity of these two regimes, which do you think is going to be reliable or prevail? On that point, I just want to remind you of the most famous quotes of Winston Churchill, who said about America, that is to say, the United States does the right thing after exhausting all other possibilities. And not just about America, but democracy. Democracy is the best political regime after implementing all other kinds of regime. China under Xi Jinping is synonymous to one single individual. The fate of China is going to be dependent very much on the biological limit of this single individual, which is not permanent. So in the next 10, 15 years, there will be a point when we will have to discuss the China question, this time the unraveling of the regime.
And what about, you're saying that in 10 or 15 years we will have to discuss it. And why not now?
In 2027, 2 years from now, Xi Jinping is going to face another party contest. And he may not be so sure if he can get, quote unquote, elected by his party colleagues. We can't see what's going on inside the party political bureau, Politburo, but Xi Jinping may be very much in a rush to show to the nation and to the Chinese community as a whole that he is the greatest achiever, greater even than Chairman Mao. Time, the clock is ticking, time is limited. Even if he succeeds in getting elected, once again, quote unquote, by his party members, once again, to extend his already limitless term to the 4th term, then the next 5 years is going to be crucial. In between, there is going to be a huge temptation that something ought to be done now, before it's too late, about Taiwan. So it's going to be a very precarious situation. There is no national interest, in my view, for Japan to team up with such a vulnerable communist regime. So the stakes are there for Japan to help build the Make America Great Again regime.
Yes, but on the other hand, I must say that the relationship between European Union and China is quite flourishing, I must say. Well, flourishing, maybe it's not the correct word, but we have very, very strong cooperation between all of the European Union countries, especially when we look at the energy sector. European Union is dependent in 98% of the rare earth materials who are coming to EU the supply chain is dominated by China. And actually, if we look at the solar panels, at the batteries, at the whole EV sector, I believe at this moment, maybe it will be a bit controversial, I believe we rather need cooperation and not confrontation at this current moment if we want to go along with all of the policies, especially climate policies, that we agreed on.
I wouldn't disagree with what you said, because that's the situation everywhere. If you look at South American countries like Peru, Chile, which are members of the Pacific-wide trade regime of TPP, nonetheless are dependent very much on one single country, that is China. The same goes with Japanese economy. If you look at house brand names such as Honda, Nissan, Toyota, you name it, they are all pretty much dependent on the Chinese consumer market. Such being the case, you need to come back to who you are. Are you willing to live under the authoritarian regime, or would you like to live under an open governance regime? I, for one, would not like to live under digital Leninism, which I think Xi Jinping's regime is now implementing. So there will be a time, sooner rather than later, I think in Europe, to give a second thought to that dependence, that degree of dependence in many respects on China. And that effort has to be led by Germany, which is most dependent on China.
Thank you very much. And I believe Hungarian foreign policy has a very unique role in it with its connectivity strategy. So opening its door to different foreign economies, but at the same time, not depending on them 100%. All right, Anthony, you were quiet for quite some time. So based on the index that you are the editor of, the Index of Economic Freedom, who are the economic winners and who are the economic losers today, and actually why the situation is exactly like this?
If I may, Liliana, rather than getting into losers and winners, may I take a half step back?
Of course.
Because I love to be in Ludovika University. This is not my first time. And I know you are attending this wonderful session with us voluntarily. You are not forced to come in to get extra credit. I noticed this is Thursday. This is basically the beginning of the good weekend, right? And the sun's coming in. I think our audience here is a bit too serious. I know the topic we are talking about serious, but I want you to relax. I want you to think about, big picture here and there. Now, my last name is Kim. So I'm definitely from Korea, but the question becomes, am I from North or South? If you're curious about it, come to talk to me after this session. Obviously, I'm from South Korea. My key point is that I'm trying to combine Liliana's first question to what we've been discussing in order to get into losers and winners. The big difference between North Korea and South Korea is, once again, freedom. And I think that that's really simple mathematical equation. North Korea, South Korea. South Korea minus North Korea is basically freedom. So the reason I'm saying that is, I don't know if you've been to Washington, but you will come visit Washington at some point. Then you do have my open invitation to visit the Heritage Foundation I'm from. We have a vision statement in the Heritage Foundation when you enter the building. As an American think tank, we want to build an America where freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society flourish. That is our vision, and that is our policy orientation. And I think that we can apply the same thing for Hungary. You are here to build a Hungary where freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society flourish. And that's why you do this kind of annual, policy festival and conversations and everything. And I'm particularly delighted and honored to share the stage with Dr. Liam Fox, because he's the one actually practicing this vision for Great Britain, to build a Great Britain, where freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society flourish. So my point is, our journey here is very clear, crystal clear. We talked about freedom. We talked about danger of different kind of ideas. We should keep it in mind. There's no permanent victory. There are always constant battles. I'm not talking about military battles. I'm talking about battles of ideas. And ideas do have consequences. So, quickly coming to your question, Liliana, winners and losers. I think winners are very clear. Those countries who try to develop policies to get to where freedom, opportunity, prosperity, civil society flourish, I think that's a clear winner. No one talks about this can be done overnight. It takes time. It's a process. It's unfortunate what's been happening in the United States when it comes down to different economic policies, government spending, regulatory burden. Unfortunately, this is the same, more or less, same situation in Great Britain as well. And there are countries, once upon a time, very successful. I'm talking about this specific country, Argentina. Argentina has been declining over the years because they lost vision, they lost direction, they lost orientation. But the good news is, with this new president, Milei, we'll see what happens, but he seems to try to go a different direction from past years. So my final point is that losers and winners, there are no permanent losers and winners. Like I said, the journey we are doing together is very important because this is really about battle of ideas. We got to pursue, obviously, good ideas.
Well, I wanted a more concrete answer. Who are the winners and who are the losers? But I understand this perspective. Going back to the question of traditional power competition, or the fact that today's it's not so important. Maybe nowadays it's more about economics and technology. So my question to Sir Liam Fox would be, are we going back to this traditional strong nations, strong economies, or what matters now more is rather strong economies and very highly developed technology?
Well, I think the shape of the world is changing, and I think it has been changing for some time. And I think that we are moving away from some of the post-World War II 20th century views of organization of the world. So the concept of the geographical block is diminishing, I think. I think if Fukuyama had called his book The End of Geography, not The End of History, he'd have been a lot closer to the mark. We're moving away from some of those traditional views, and countries are beginning to look for countries that are like them ideologically and in terms of values and economically, rather than the ones that are immediately proximate to them. A good example of that is what's happening in the Middle East with the Abraham Accords. So you've got Morocco in the Abraham Accords with Israel, with Bahrain, and with the UAE, because Morocco is much more like those countries than it is Algeria, its next door neighbor. And I think that the trend in the world that's not talked about a great deal is that we will look for countries who are like us. In defense, we've got the new AUKUS arrangement, so the United Kingdom, United States, Australia, countries that are not remotely geographically proximate, but are very similar in their world outlook, very similar economically, and I think that's the pattern that's going to happen. And I think it's no accident that you get countries like Russia, Iran, and China forming alliances. They're not close to one another, but they're close ideologically, and they're the mirror image of what we are in the free world.
So is it about ideology at the end of the day?
It's about, well, it's ideologies behind a lot of these things. It's not an accident that the world's richest countries are the world's richest countries. I'll give you a tiny example. On the day that they became independent from the United Kingdom, Malaysia and Malawi had the same GDP per capita. So how you move forward, the mechanisms you adopt, the governance procedures that you have, and the economic values you hold will determine very much of prosperity. Now, we know what makes countries prosperous. Money has no sentiment. Money will go to where money can be made, money can be moved, and money can be removed if necessary. Which is why China had such a bad year for foreign direct investment last year. People no longer believe they can get their money back out the system. And if you sat down and you look at the economic work that's done, the academic work, it's very clear. If you want to enrich your country, then you do a number of things. You improve your governance, including your property law. You improve the skills of your working population and improve the flexibility of your labor law. You have a stable regulatory environment. You have a permissive tax system. You have a higher education system that allows collaboration with business. You have English skills, because English is the global economic language. You have access to tech, and you have good IP protection. If you can tick all those boxes, money will come. It's not magic. There's no mystery to it. And so countries that are willing to accept those elements can join the club of wealthier nations. Those who deny those things will be down in Anthony's losers column.
Maybe it would be a naive follow-up question, but you mentioned the similar economic mechanism, etc., etc. Wouldn't it mean that all of the countries in the European Union should have a very similar GDP growth, and we wouldn't have countries with some economic crisis, and we wouldn't have, for example, Poland that is actually developing and has a growing GDP since more than 20 years, and then we wouldn't have Greece, for example, that is struggling a lot, where we are actually in the same organization?
Well, you have different elements that are holding countries back. So in a lot of Western countries, it's demographics. With an aging population. Poland has got a very young population in comparison with some. But you've got countries like Germany, which are very, very heavily dependent on manufacturing exports, therefore will be affected by the global economy more than a country like the United Kingdom, which is less dependent on manufacturing and more dependent on service exports. So the countries all have very different elements to differentiate them. So fortunately, the bureaucrats in Brussels have not yet managed to create the single European economy because it's the diversity amongst those economies that leads to their strength in adversity.
Thank you very much. Professor Taniguchi, how is the new technology like AI and different digital system actually changing global power?
It is indeed changing before our eyes in many respects, and you might want to come to a conclusion that China in this game is going to outpace the United States. The verdict is not yet done. The jury is still out. You should not underestimate the magnetic power of the United States that has kept drawing the best talent from all corners of the world. Even if Donald Trump does something temporarily different from the past pattern, I don't think this power is going to erode anytime soon. Whereas in China, even if they've got one of the biggest populations in human history, they speak, as Sir Liam said, the language not universally spoken. And you're dealing with some of the network externalities. If you use economist jargon, the bigger the population, the greater the effect of the network you're talking about. Artificial intelligence and other new technologies can only be developed by maximizing the number of network. And those of you who are on a open, transparent regime which just happens to speak the lingua franca of English will, in the long run, a victor, if you like, rather than a regime where you can't cherish freedom of experiment, freedom of thoughts, freedom of opinions.
Thank you very much. Anthony, how can countries keep their economies open I mean, we actually discussed it a little bit, but I'm curious about your perspective. So how can countries keep their economies open, but also protect their security and independence?
So again, I want to repeat what I said earlier. There's no permanent victory, always constant battles of ideas, policy options. So it's not like there are set of preset winners, preset losers. This is really a constant battle. So nowadays, when we talk about economic freedom, I want to be crystal clear that we are not talking about rocket science or some kind of big picture philosophy. We are really talking about economic resilience and good economic governance. As Sir Liam Fox eloquently elaborated, there are many dimensions and factors. So the annual index we publish at the Heritage Foundation every year, if you see that, it's very clear what kind of good policy directions each country should pursue if it wants to really be long-term, prosperous, and resilient. So I think the key question here is how do we keep that momentum and policy discussion going on? Because there are many temptations around the world. And there are no quick, easy shortcuts, but I think a lot of policymakers around the world, somehow they think that they can get there whatever easier way, but it's always constant process in terms of sharpening up and keeping things really on principle. So I think we should keep that in mind in terms of pursuing that, and that's how we can achieve economic resilience and economic security in the long term.
So how can we actually keep this momentum? So we need to constantly adjust to different...
adaptability and also this kind of conversations at national level, local level, and this very festival we are doing today, I think this is also part of that as well. Because like I said, freedom is not automatically given to you. The government is not there to distribute freedom to you unless you start demanding it, unless you start talking about it. So I think that really, to get there, this is really like a very wide range of issues we need to get involved and also demand, ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Just on that, we also require governments to think in different timescales than they do today, because most Western governments will think, what do I have to do in the next 4 years to get re-elected, rather than what path do I have to put the country on to deal with some of these wider issues. I mean, we mentioned earlier Chinese dominance in batteries, in rare earths, and so on. This didn't come as a great surprise to us. This trend had been there for a long time. Our policymakers failed to implement policies of diversification in our economies, and they walked into what has effectively been a security trap. The short-termism of our political systems is one of the detrimental things that we have in our concepts of freedom. Tolstoy said the two most powerful warriors were patience and time. Neither of these assets are much deployed by short-term Western governments.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And I feel like, especially in the EU, we really like to actually implement certain policies without actually measuring what can happen after we implement them. So what about the international institutions? Because I believe there is a narrative right now that they are actually quite weak. And I believe it's a kind of legit narrative, at least in my opinion. So how countries like UK or countries in Central Eastern Europe actually can protect their national interests at a time when those international institutions either failed or they are just weak?
Well, a few years ago, about 2013, Condi Rice, who I know well, and I was writing my first book at the time, and I went to see her, and over lunch we gave one another a piece of paper, and it had the World Bank, the IMF, the EU, the UN, all the WTO, all the global institutions, and we said, give them a mark out of 10, and then after lunch we swapped them over to see what we'd done, and we gave them almost exactly the same marks, except for the European Union. She gave it a higher mark than I did, unsurprisingly. But there is a real failure. A lot of these global institutions were designed for the post-World War II half of the 20th century. They have not adapted well to the 21st century, to any of the technological advances that we've made. In fact, some of them have gone backwards. I give you the World Trade Organization as a great example. It was set up to make sure that we went on a process of liberalizing trade, enabling more countries to take advantage of free trade, and in fact it's done the opposite. And for one reason that nobody really foresaw, which is that within the constitution of the World Trade Organization, they decided that the word consensus should be interpreted as unanimity. Now, if consensus meant unanimity, there wouldn't be two different words in the dictionary. And the fact that they took this particular definition meant that every member of the WTO had a veto over policy. Now, it's impossible to move forward in that position. You've got the Security Council. You've got Russia sitting on the Security Council, having just invaded a democratic European nation. So a whole load of these institutions need quite dramatic change. But to get that change, you've got to have the leadership. You've got to have the visionary global leadership that you had with Ronald Reagan taking the WTO from the GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, into the WTO. What seems to me lacking is that same problem that I just mentioned. It's too short term. Everything is too narrowly focused on what happens with the next election, rather than what path do I put my country on, and do I put our people on, and do I put the world on to give the next generation a leg up in prosperity and security. We are, I'm afraid, very short of global leadership at a time when we desperately need it.
I don't know if abandoning veto, especially in the European Union, would be a good idea, especially coming from Central Eastern European country. But we can discuss it further. Professor Taniguchi, what role can Japan or other Asian nations play in actually supporting a value-based world order alongside with the West?
Based on its own national interest, derived from the geographic imperative that Japan is direct neighbor to Russia, North Korea, China. Japan for some time, especially under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, has chosen to broaden its reach towards like-minded nations. Brexit, indeed, for Japan has a huge blessing, because there was an anticipation after Brexit, Britain, calling itself Global Britain, is going to get closer to such countries as Japan. The consequence of which is Britain has officially joined Trans-Pacific Partnership. That might sound odd to you. Great Britain has been and will continue to be an Atlantic nation. Nonetheless, as Sir Liam mentioned previously, that birds of the same feather are flocking together once again. And that's exactly what Japan is doing. India deserves a special mentioning. The Japanese government for some time has chosen to have a long-term view in investing in India, buying its long-term possibility. Already, India has outnumbered China and has become the biggest populated nation in the world. In 20 years' time, in terms of technology, in terms of military, in terms of economy, India is going to be as big as China, or even bigger than China in many respects. So the nations need to invest in a long-term future of that kind, and I think that's what Japan is doing. And China in this context has been a great propellant to urge such countries as ASEAN nations, Japan and others, to come to terms with where they are, who they are. And I think the formulation of freedom, free and open Indo-Pacific regime, or the Quad, which is actually sustaining the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific, are the harbingers, if you like, of the future to come.
Thank you very much. And Anthony, we didn't discuss actually at all the new US administration, but my question would be, do you think that the America First approach to economic strength and actually self-reliance could also work in Central Eastern European countries? Is it possible at all?
Short answer is yes, and we also want to remind our audience that America First is not America only. It's not America, alone. So we will do things together as we go, but for now, the focus is how to really reconfigure policies that are directly related to the American economy and domestic situation. So that's why, for example, border crisis and inflation, economic issues within the United States, that takes first chunk of the big, Trump policies so far. But as you will see, we will have greater engagement. I mean, if Trump himself is really isolationist, he wouldn't have met a lot of foreign leaders so far. He's been meeting many foreign leaders. He's been having great conversations with your prime minister as well. So I think it's a bit too premature to say, America First will be just America First. I really think that America First is not America only and America alone. On your earlier question, I must say the problem we have with the international organizations, it's not about their being weak. I think the problem we have is that we do not have effective international organizations we can work together in. And also, we've been having these strange conversations when it comes down to international organizations because they had a very strange agenda. I'm talking about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and also, to a certain degree, man becomes a woman, woman becomes man, and there's in between. I think if we are talking about that kind of ideas and agenda, again, bad ideas in my view, and de-emphasizing the value of family, I think we are in big trouble. And I think that's why a lot of people see international organizations, whether it's UN, even World Bank, and you name it, even EU. We have a very, very strange, very frustrated situation when it comes down to that kind of agenda and leadership. So perhaps this is time for us, really, this isn't right. This is time for us to reconfigure and even correct the course of what's been happening.
Thank you very much. So my very last question to all of you would be to tell me how important nowadays are the alliances based on shared values. I believe we all sitting here have same shared values, so how important those alliances are, especially now in this very divided and actually unpredictable dynamic world situation. Sir Liam Fox. And we have very little time, so I must ask you for a short...
So the one I'm thinking of that's of most relevance right now is NATO. And NATO is both a political organization and a military one. And it's all very well to have shared values, but you've also got to have shared work and shared and burden sharing. And it's been for a long time very clear that the Americans would lose patience with the European elements of NATO who would not spend what they were committed to, who would not provide the political will for deployment. And we've reached a point that was absolutely inevitable, that's been coming for a long time, because a lot of European leaders simply would not accept the reality that they couldn't stay on the American taxpayers' coattails indefinitely. Fortunately, of all the bad things that have happened recently, there has been a real wake-up call amongst European NATO members who recognize that they now must carry a fair share of the burden.
Thank you very much. Professor Taniguchi, how important are the
Right. Not long ago, in the mid-1990s, the mantra was retreat of the nation. The sovereignty did not matter. That was proven wrong. Sovereignty is still important, and as we have discussed throughout the day, border control is important. Now, alliance equally was a bad word for many years, but they're coming back to the value of alliances. After all, that's a mutual self-insurance policy. And in the case of countries such as Japan, which is in a very much precarious neighborhood, the premium of the insurance must be paid by that country. And I think that's exactly what Japan is doing. Luckily, Great Britain, once again, is coming closer to the region. This year, we're going to host the deployment of HMS Prince of Wales, one of the newly built aircraft carriers and its strike group, visiting Australia, Japan, and other nations. So alliances are important as a long-term assurance tool for countries like Japan.
Thank you very much. Antony?
Just quickly, when we talk about alliance, there are many different levels, bilateral and minilateral or multilateral. But I want to emphasize that alliance is not really something that will be forever. There will be different times and different requirements and different commitments. So this is why I think this is time for us to really recommit ourselves to our values and correct courses, and then if necessary, we have to disagree to agree. So I think this is what's happening, but ultimately, alliance is really about adding and multiplying good ideas so that we can get to next height of the good alliance, and obviously this is a process. So NATO is a perfect example, and I think that what's happening in NATO, ultimately, this is healthy, and I think we will make NATO really stronger.
Great again. Thank you very much to our great speakers. Thank you very much for this discussion. Please join me in applause for our speakers. Thank you very much.